Debra Morgan knew Dexter was a killer. She knew he had been living a double life, hiding his darkest secret in plain sight. And yet, she never turned him in. Was it loyalty, fear, or something even darker? Debra wasn't just protecting her brother. She was trapped in a psychological web of manipulation, trauma, and blind devotion. She had spent her entire life idolizing Dexter, believing he was her rock, the only person she could trust. But when the truth finally came out, she didn't run. She didn't stop him. She couldn't. Because for Debra, turning Dexter in wasn't just about justice. It was about admitting her entire life had been a lie, and by the time she realized it, she had already sacrificed too much to walk away. Think about it. From the moment she was a child, Debra was living in Dexter's shadow. Harry, the man she idolized, was always more focused on Dexter. Dexter was the favorite, the special one, the one getting private lessons while she was left wondering why she wasn't enough. That kind of thing messes with you. Debra spent her whole life trying to prove herself. To Harry, to the police force, to Dexter. And deep down, she wanted one thing more than anything else. Dexter's approval. He was her rock, her constant. No matter how many terrible relationships she got into, no matter how much she drank, Dexter was always there. And when you make someone your entire world, it's almost impossible to see them for who they really are. But here's the thing. Dexter wasn't just some overprotective big brother. He was a serial killer. And when Debra finally discovered the truth, it shattered everything she believed in. And the worst part? She didn't just lose trust in Dexter, she lost trust in herself. She had spent years honing her instincts as a detective, learning to read people, to detect deception. Yet, the one person she was closest to had been lying to her face every single day. If she had been so blind about him, what else had she been wrong about? This wasn't just a betrayal, it was an identity crisis. Psychologically, this kind of dependence is devastating. It rewires how you see the world. Studies show that when someone becomes the foundation of your emotional security, breaking away from them feels like tearing out a part of yourself. And for Debra, Dexter was that foundation. Losing him would mean losing everything she thought made her strong. And here's where it gets even more tragic. Dexter didn't just manipulate strangers. He manipulated Debra without even trying. He didn't need to gaslight her, didn't need to control her actions. His presence alone kept her in check, because every time she looked at him, she saw the person she had fought so hard to protect. And if she admitted he was a monster, she would have to admit that all her sacrifices had been for nothing. So when she finally learned the truth, her mind did what many do when faced with an unbearable reality. It rationalized. It twisted itself into knots trying to make sense of it. Maybe he wasn't a bad person. Maybe Harry had given him the code for a reason. Maybe Dexter needed her. And if she turned him in, she wouldn't just be betraying him. She'd be betraying the version of herself who had spent a lifetime defending him. That's why she didn't see the truth sooner. Not because she was naive, not because she was foolish, but because sometimes the truth is too painful to face. Imagine this. You've spent your entire life believing your brother is a good person. A little weird? Sure. Emotionally distant? Definitely. But a good person. And then one night, you walk in on him stabbing a man in the chest. Debra's world collapsed in that moment. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had been blind. Every red flag, every gut feeling, every offhand comment about Dexter being different, she had ignored them all. And now, standing there, gun in hand, she had to make a choice. Did she do what a cop was supposed to do? Or did she do what a sister needed to do? She chose Dexter, not because she was weak, but because in that moment she couldn't separate who he was from who she needed him to be. Turning him in wasn't just about sending a serial killer to prison. It was about destroying the only stable thing in her life. And once she made that choice, there was no going back. This was the beginning of a psychological spiral. She didn't just cover for him, she started rationalizing his actions. Maybe he wasn't evil. Maybe this was just his way of delivering justice. And most dangerously, maybe he needed her. The moment she let him go, she was no longer just Dexter's sister. She became his accomplice. And from that point forward, every decision she made would be shaped by that terrible, irreversible choice. Here's where things get really twisted. Debra didn't just admire Dexter, she admired Harry. She spent her whole life trying to live up to his legacy, to make him proud. And what was Harry's biggest rule? Protect Dexter at all costs. But what's even more unsettling is that Harry's influence didn't just shape Dexter. It shaped Debra just as much. She was raised in the shadow of a man who, for all his noble intentions, had a dangerous flaw. He believed he could control the uncontrollable. He built a system around Dexter, believing that a structured set of rules could keep his son's darkness in check. But in doing so, he didn't just create a killer, he created an enabler. Debra was unknowingly conditioned to see Dexter as above the rules. Think about it. Harry was her moral compass, the man she trusted more than anyone. And if he believed Dexter needed special treatment, why would she ever question it? Even after Harry died, that programming remained. Every time Dexter got away with something, every time he walked out of an interrogation room unscratched, it reinforced the idea that he was different, that he was supposed to be protected. By the time she saw Dexter for what he really was, it was too late. The damage had been done. Because turning him in wasn't just betraying Dexter, it was betraying Harry's legacy. And for Debra, that was an impossible choice to make. Let's talk about something really dark. Debra wasn't just emotionally attached to Dexter, she was psychologically dependent on him. This goes beyond sibling loyalty. This was a toxic, codependent relationship where Dexter held all the power. And the most terrifying part? He didn't even have to try. This is where Stockholm Syndrome comes into play. It's a psychological response where a victim develops deep emotional ties to their captor, often justifying or even defending their actions. And while Dexter wasn't holding Debra hostage in a traditional sense, he was the center of her emotional universe. She was trapped in a cycle of dependence, where the very person destroying her was also the only one she felt she could rely on. She couldn't leave him because she didn't know how. Dexter was the one person who had never abandoned her. No matter how many times she failed, how many bad choices she made, how lost she felt, Dexter was there. And when she discovered his secret, that dependency didn't disappear. If anything, it grew stronger. Because now she had something new to rationalize. If she had spent her entire life trusting him, how could she suddenly turn on him now? Dexter played into this dynamic effortlessly. He knew exactly how to manipulate people. He did it to Rita, he did it to Miguel Prado, and he did it to Debra. Not through force, not through threats, but by simply existing as the one person she believed would never betray her. And the worst part? She let him. Because the alternative, accepting that the person she trusted most had been deceiving her all along, was simply too painful to bear. If there was ever a moment where Debra could have walked away, it was when Lagerta started closing in. Lagerta knew Dexter was the Bay Harbor butcher. She had the evidence. She had the motive, and all Debra had to do was let her make the arrest. But instead, she shot Lagerta. This wasn't just a bad decision. It was the complete destruction of who Debra Morgan once was. Up until this moment, she had always believed she was on the right side of the law. No matter how much she bent the rules, no matter how emotionally compromised she became, she was still a cop, someone who fought for justice, someone who was supposed to stop people like Dexter. But in this one defining moment, she became exactly what she had sworn to fight against. Psychologically, this was the moment Debra shattered. It wasn't just about murder, it was about identity. Lagerta's death forced her to acknowledge the truth she had been suppressing for so long. She wasn't just protecting Dexter out of love, she was protecting him because she couldn't bear to face the reality of her own choices. Because if she admitted Dexter was a monster, she would have to admit that she had become one too. And that kind of guilt? It doesn't just go away, it festers. It rots you from the inside out. And for Debra, it was the beginning of a downward spiral that would ultimately consume her entirely. After Lagerta's death, Debra spiraled hard. She quit the force. She turned to drugs. She tried to run away, but she couldn't escape what she had done. The guilt was too much, because deep down, she knew the truth. Dexter had ruined her life. He had taken everything from her career, her morality, her soul. And yet, even after all of that, she still couldn't turn him in. And then came her final mistake, trying to save Dexter. When Saxon shot her, she was still playing the role of the loyal sister, still choosing Dexter over herself. And in the end, it got her killed. But let's be honest, Debra didn't just die because of Saxon. She died because of Dexter, because she spent her entire life protecting him, even when it destroyed her. And in the end, it did. The tragedy of Debra's death isn't just that she was shot, it's that it never had to happen. Her entire downward spiral, from Lagerta's murder to her self-destructive choices, led her here. Every time she could have walked away, she didn't. Every time she could have turned Dexter in, she didn't. She kept choosing him, even when it meant choosing against herself. Her death was poetic in the cruelest way possible. It was a reflection of the life she had lived, always sacrificing herself for Dexter, always cleaning up his messes, always putting him first, and even in her final moments, she didn't fight for her own survival. She fought to save him. And what did Dexter do in return? He pulled the plug. He took her out to sea like one of his victims, dropped her into the water, and let her sink. And maybe that was his way of saying goodbye, of setting her free. But let's not pretend it wasn't the final consequence of the life he forced her into. Debra's death wasn't just a moment. It was an inevitability. Because in the end, she was never going to escape Dexter's shadow. And deep down, maybe she never really wanted to. So why didn't Debra ever turn Dexter in? Was it love? Loyalty? Fear? The truth is, it was all of the above. But more than anything, it was because Dexter was her entire world. And by the time she realized the truth, she had already sacrificed everything for him. She didn't turn him in because she couldn't, because turning him in would mean admitting that her entire life had been a lie, that she had wasted everything protecting a monster, and that was a truth even Debra Morgan couldn't face. But what do you think? If you were in Debra's position, would you have done the same? Or was there a way out that she just couldn't see? And if you've made it this far, congrats. You clearly have a dark passenger of your own, always craving the next deep dive into Dexter's mind. So why not make it official? Subscribe and join the dark side. No code required. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.